FX Medicine is very proud to have posted our 200th podcast. The FX Medicine team would like to thank the enormous generosity of all our guests who have graciously donated their time, their expertise, and their stories of both triumph and adversity. Most of all, we'd like to thank you, our listeners, for your continued feedback and support, and for giving us direction and purpose as we move forward together into the future. This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. And joining me on the line today from Perth, Western Australia, is Dr. Adrian Lopresti, who's a clinical psychologist in private practice and a senior researcher at Murdoch University in Perth. He's over 20 years of clinical experience working with children through to adults suffering from a range of mental health conditions, including depressive and anxiety-related disorders. Dr. Lopresti has completed his PhD and published several articles in peer-reviewed journals on the effects of diet, nutraceuticals, sleep and exercise on biological pathways associated with depression, ADHD and bipolar disorder. He's also completed clinical trials investigating the antidepressant effects of curcumin and saffron in people with depression and anxiety. Dr. Lopresti is a strong advocate of psychological, nutritional and lifestyle-based interventions to enhance mental health and continues to conduct research in this area. Welcome to FX Medicine, Adrian.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks for that welcome.
Well, I've got to say thank you for taking time off on this Western Australian holiday. I'm just imagining you in your fluffy bunny slippers sitting back there at home.
It's a good picture. It's not a good picture, actually, but we'll go with it.
So I've got to go back to your background. Tell us about how, as a psychologist, you got interested in nutritional medicine. What tipped the scale? Have you always had this interest? Yeah, I've always had interest in nutrition and exercise just from a personal interest. And I mean, I went down the traditional routes of psychology, learning more about the psychological therapies. And then through my first, I suppose, decade of practice, I primarily used the psychological treatments, cognitive behaviour therapy and kind of off streams of that. And that was effective for many people, but I suppose I really wanted to, I was really interested in that holistic approach, looking at not just coping skills and belief systems and ways we can kind of manage our emotions through psychological techniques, but I really wanted to look at how nutrition and exercise and general lifestyle factors can improve mood. And that's what led me to kind of read up in the area, learn more about the area. And I became more and more interested as it went by. And from there, I did my PhD looking at lifestyle treatments, looking at diet. And in particular, a big part of my PhD was looking at the effects of curcumin in the area of depression. Yeah. Now, I've got to sort of go back to this because you did some work with Felice Jacka, Professor Felice Jacka is just like this awesome researcher with regards to diet and mood disorders. But I've got to ask you how you were viewed by your colleagues or your cohort during your studies with this weird hippie way of therapy. Were you accepted? Were you questioned or were you ridiculed? I haven't been ridiculed. I think there's a lot of psychologists who are actually quite interested in the effects of diet and supplementation and so forth on mental health disorders. So I don't think, I certainly haven't been rejected. I think a lot of psychologists don't quite understand the connection, and that confuses them a little bit. But I've had several workshops that I've conducted, and it's been very well attended, and the reception's been really good. I suppose the issue for psychologists is really just trying to understand the mechanisms behind how kind of diet in particular can affect mood, which we do not cover at all during our training. I think this is a really interesting, very controversial topic that there are certain, proponents of supplements will say that doctors don't cover diet, and then the doctors will say they do. And yet whenever I've interviewed an integrative doctor, they said, no, we definitely didn't. So it's really interesting who thinks they do and don't, and to what degree. Certainly not to the degree of a dietitian or a nutritionist.
No, and I think, even, you might talk about, in our training, we might talk about having a healthy diet and touch on that. But, even the definition of what a healthy diet, I don't think psychologists necessarily have an understanding of what that is.
The assumption of a healthy diet, yes. What about this concept of inflammation in depression? I actually covered this with Professor Gordon Parker some years ago, and he said, look, maybe in certain things, but he wasn't really convinced. And yet the more and more I read about this, it's got to be a player, maybe not the major cause, but it's got to be a player, at least in the driver of continued depression. But what do you think? Well, where did your interest in this spark?
Well, I think the research is pretty convincing that inflammation does play a role in depression and other mental health disorders. So, there's an increasing body of research to support that. I don't think necessarily inflammation or inflammatory processes is not necessarily the driver of all people's depression, but I think it's important. And we really, I suppose the other thing too is, while inflammation has a role, there's still, the key for me is always, what's the cause of the inflammation? What's the cause of somebody presenting with depression? And inflammation doesn't necessarily, having a high CRP, for example, doesn't tell you about where that high CRP is coming from. So I want to really get into more the nitty-gritty and try to identify what it is that might be driving that inflammation for that individual, which might be very different to somebody else. But absolutely, I think inflammation, oxidative stress has a role. It certainly impacts on neurotransmitter production, and the research is, as I said, is convincing.
One of the things you mentioned then was just this key thing about how do we mark inflammation? Do we have to look at the fulminant signal of inflammation, tumour necrosis factor alpha and things like that? Rather than that, should we be looking at lower forms, like, for instance, high sensitivity CRP? And where do we look? I have concerns about if we're looking for a fulminant marker of inflammation, like we would see in something like Crohn's. That's why we always fail when we're looking at interventions to reduce these. Even NF-kappa B, for instance, there are trials out there which show that curcumin fails to reduce NF-kappa B, but I wonder if that's the correct marker we should be looking for. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I wrote a paper a while ago talking a bit about some of the, I suppose, biomarkers that we could use to identify depression, and also whether we could use them as markers to determine treatment progress.
Yeah.
And the reality is that there is no marker, there's no single marker that can do that, and I don't think there ever will be. I think there's probably some value in developing some type of algorithm to look at a whole collection of different markers, and from there maybe identify things. But I think that to use a marker as an identifier of inflammation is, a single identifier of inflammation is going to be flawed, and it may lead you into the wrong direction. Yeah.
And you covered I think it was another podcast I heard you in where you were looking at atypical depression. That interested me because Mike Asher's had this mucosal management sort of thing for atypical depression, and it stunned me about the prevalence of it as part of depression as a whole. Can you take our listeners through just how important it is to look for atypical depression, and why is it atypical?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing with atypical depression is that it is the most typical type of depression. So it can confuse people a little bit. So it's about 40% of the population presents with the atypical form, of which there seems to be an immune activity is enhanced in atypical depression. So for the listeners who don't know some of the symptoms associated with atypical depression, I'll just list them. So, the first one is, one of them is weight gain, or kind of increased appetites can occur. People with atypical depression will also have hypersomnia, so they'll want to sleep more rather than sleep less. There's the heavy limbs, leaden paralysis, which often can occur in people with atypical depression. They also have a sensitivity to interpersonal rejection. So I'm kind of asking questions around that. And then finally, with people with atypical depression, they react to positive events. So their mood can lift when they're experiencing a positive event. So they're kind of the symptoms if you want to identify whether somebody's presenting with atypical depression. And as I said, there's an immune kind of response there. And what was interesting that I found in my study with the curcumin was that when I looked at curcumin for depression as a whole, it was effective through a double-blind placebo-controlled study. But what I actually found was that curcumin in particular, and now that's been confirmed in 2 studies that I've done, was particularly effective for people with atypical depression. So there was enhanced effectiveness in that subgroup of individuals. So I think that's one of the things, if you wanted to look at, rather than look at biomarkers, but look at symptoms, these people are presenting with these types of symptoms, there's probably some immune inflammatory process going on, and then we need to look at some form of anti-inflammatory treatment.
One of the symptoms of that atypical depression, sorry to harp on about this, but it really interests me, is that interpersonal rejection and how that would maybe marry with inflammation. I'm scratching it here. I don't know. But is there any sort of gender difference with regards to who might suffer from atypical depression? Females more than males, for instance, who might be more in touch with their feelings?
Yeah, I think the research is indicating that more women suffer from the atypical form.
Right.
So I think that plays a part. There's some really interesting research also showing that inflammation increases sensitization to stresses and to negativity. Yeah. And there's been some studies showing that if you expose somebody to inflammatory toxin, inflammatory endotoxin, then they become more reactive to rejection. So somewhere around that inflammatory process then affects neurostructures that are associated with that I suppose, sensitization to rejection and negativity.
So I guess that ties in with the gut-brain axis, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the gut is the key for a lot of diseases, and we're confirming that now more with mental health disorders, which is again one that unfortunately my colleagues don't necessarily quite understand the connection. Certainly, we know that stress can affect the gut, but as many of the listeners are already aware of, that the gut can also affect the brain, and if we can do something through some gut healing, then we may have a positive effect on brain function.
Absolutely. Now, you chose curcumin BCM95 and saffron and sage as interventions for your research. Other researchers use different forms of curcumin. There's the C3 plus the piperine, there's Longvita. I don't know of any others at the moment, but there's probably more coming out. There's a bit of a war. In fact, there's a lot of a war. Ours is best. Ours is always best. And yet, a lot of the preclinical stuff was done on even the lowest absorption, dare I say that word. Do you think the type of formulation is critical, or do you think there's a lot of turf war going on here?
Oh, look, I think a lot of it, there is a lot of marketing going on around the bioavailability, and ours is more bioavailable than yours. And there's always questions around how people assess bioavailability and some of the markers that they use to identify that. And so there's issues around that. I think, that's currently the key around kind of the marketing side of things. But as you've mentioned already, even, standard curcumin has shown to have some benefits. And I've struggled with this bioavailability issue for quite some time, and I'm actually in the process of writing a paper at the moment talking a bit about, well, maybe it's not bioavailability that's right. The issue. Maybe it's about, the issue I just talked about earlier is about the curcumin and its gut-enhancing effects. And so, what I've, learning from the research is that curcumin certainly has may have a positive effect on microbial ecology and from that point of view, and also has in animal studies has shown to have an impact on intestinal permeability. And so maybe by enhancing gut function and therefore reducing inflammation via that way, and therefore also improving kind of nutrient absorption and hormonal production. Maybe that's how at least partly how curcumin works, through its enhancement of gut function.
I think it's really interesting about even the term bioavailability. I think that's even been bastardized a bit for marketing terms. I think we're really talking about absorption of curcumin. You know, and even that, as you say, it's with you're sort of harping on about something once, perhaps because of the horse has already bolted. It might actually be healing it at the gut levels, which is a very good point to investigate. I think that's really good.
Yeah, I think that's the next area really. And it was interesting. One of the studies that I did looking at curcumin, and I looked at some of the biomarkers, and one of them was a marker that may be associated with leaky gut. And so the theory and having elevated levels of this biomarker was associated with increased efficacy from curcumin. So potentially people with kind of leaky gut may particularly be beneficial from curcumin. So, I mean, there's other things within the curcumin too that I think are beneficial. I mean, I chose the BCM initially because of the bioavailability research, so I was certainly intrigued by that. But you know, it also contains turmeric oils and things like that, which are used to enhance its bioavailability or its absorption. But I think turmeric also has your antimicrobial function and things like that, which may be beneficial too.
So you might be again working on the microbiota sway. Right.
Potentially.
I think one of the things, whenever I hear about these newfangled, better ways of absorbing a food component, I always try and go back to, well, where did this research actually start with food? So why don't we look at food? How about we do that first?
Absolutely.
And I've often told people who I've given curcumins to is that always make sure your tongue's yellow at some stage during the day, preferably not from a texter.
Maybe there's turmeric textures coming around. That might be a good one.
There you go, increased bioavailability. One of the things I was interested in was the inclusion of saffron. And this has been a bit of a favourite herb of Jerome Saris in his research. But I like the earlier work, referring back to this guy, I think it was an Iranian called Shahin Akonzida. And then there was work done by Heather Hausenblaus, really interesting, not just for depression, but for anxiety and other things, insomnia. So why did you choose to do the both? And I've got to ask then, which did you find was the major player? Could you tease apart an effect of each or both? Were they important to have together?
Initially I chose both because, I had already done a study just on curcumin on its own. So then I wanted to replicate it, and I had thought that maybe if we combine the two together, they might increase the efficacy. Obviously we know that, incorporating herbs and spices in our diet is important for health, and you wouldn't just have one herb or one spice every day. You'd want to combine it. So I used the combination. I did had 4 conditions in the study. So there was one condition was the placebo, and then there was 2 conditions which varying doses of the curcumin of the BCM, and then there was one condition which combined the two, the BCM and the saffron. Mm-hmm. Now, what I found was that the 3 active conditions were more effective than the placebo, but there was no difference between the 3 groups in terms of the efficacy. So the low dose curcumin was just as effective as the high dose, and the combined ingredients were just as effective as the others. Now, saying that, the study was flawed in that when you're comparing active treatment conditions, you really do need quite large sample sizes. And so if the actors were effective by 30% and the combined was effective by 40%, it would only be a 10% improvement. And to identify that through statistical analysis, you need quite large sample sizes. So we didn't have that. So,
but that's your next one. That's your next trial.
That's the next one. And the other one that I didn't have was I didn't have saffron on its own compared to curcumin. And that would have been nice to see. So
yeah. I think this is it's the thing that dogs so much of integrative medicine research, and that is the numbers. How do you get even a number to treat when you haven't even got a decent sample size? Yeah. But having said that, I think the thing must be acknowledged that it's really hard to patent an egg. Admittedly, we're using a patented type form of curcumin, but it's very hard to get research paid for that will include those massive numbers that we see in the pharmacological trials.
And that's the problem. I think that I've been fortunate enough, and this is I suppose one of the criticisms too, is that I've been funded by the company. The studies were funded by the company that the BCM, the company that owns BCM.
Yeah.
Now, saying that they've been, they're extremely ethical company, and basically they've provided the funds, and we at Murdoch University have independently run the study, but people still criticised the study, saying, look, well, it's industry funded. Well, the response to that is, well, where else am I going to get the money from?
No, that's exactly right. I think it's really interesting when you get people like the Friends of Science. They want to see the evidence of any nutritional intervention, but they refuse any research investigations into that because you can't get it from government, so you've got to get it from enterprise, so therefore it's skewed. And therefore it's of no use. So it's that you're done either way, really, aren't you?
Yeah.
So where to now with your research? What is your next on the agenda?
Well, at the moment I'm doing a study looking at Saffron on its own for teenagers.
Yep.
So we'll finish recruiting in the next week or two. So that study is looking at Saffron in teenagers aged between the age of 12 and 16 suffering from low mood or anxiety. And I want to really look at the effects of saffron in that population, and I think that's children and teenagers is an area that's quite neglected in relation to research in general, but also particularly natural ingredients and supplements and things like that. So that's one that I'm about to do, and hopefully we'll have the data published by the end of the year. So that'd be interesting. The other one that I've just got to manage time to do really is I want to look at, I'm very much into it. While we talked about supplements, the reality is that in my practice I never ever have somebody come in and I say, here's some saffron, see you later, or here's some curcumin, see you later. It really is an integrative approach, and that's the thing I really want to highlight is the benefits, the potential benefits of integrating changes in diet, exercise, sleep, and many of the listeners are already aware of that if you combine all of those factors, then you're going to get the most beneficial effect. And there is the danger of just using supplements, much like pharmaceutical drugs. People go, obviously many people go see their doctor and they place her on an antidepressant, and that's the only intervention. And that's the danger for many people too. They could just take saffron and think that by taking saffron that all their worries are going to go. So saying all that in a long-winded way is that basically what I would like to do is actually compare an integrative approach where it would be, maybe a 6-session treatment looking at diet, sleep. One session looks at diet, one session looks at sleep, and one session is cognitive behaviour therapy and all those different factors. And comparing that to cognitive behaviour therapy on its own. So does the integrative approach, same amount of sessions, 6 sessions for both, comparing the two groups, and does the integrative approach work as well or better than just a CBT-only treatment? Yeah,
so then you can tease out the bang for buck, because that's another one of my concerns is the cost. How do you find the acceptance of the cost when you employ an integrative approach, including supplements? Especially, I guess, for those people who might be depressed for a long period of time and might have issues with work, with maintaining work. How does it fit in?
I think one of the major criticisms I have with nutritional medicine and so forth is the cost, and obviously for many people, many practitioners talk about doing all of these fancy tests and which cost hundreds and thousands, hundreds of dollars. For people. And for many people, they just can't do that. So I think that what it really needs to be is that integrative approach needs to be very personalised. And for many people, they cannot afford hundreds of dollars of supplements every month. They cannot afford to do the testing that's required to determine kind of gut function and things like that. So when I'm seeing an individual coming into my practice, I'm assessing the individual. I'm looking at the barriers to intervention. I'm looking at their motivation to change, because obviously many people who particularly come and see me may not be interested in coming and see a psychologist. And when I talk about diet, they may not be open to making changes in that. So for me, it's really then going, okay, how about if we look at making small changes in several different areas rather than just targeting one? So if we can engage in some sleep hygiene work so they're sleeping half an hour more, if we can improve their diet by reducing soft drink consumption or drinking water consumption, it's not the ideal diet, but it's better than what it was. And not everybody needs to go on a gluten-free diet to feel better. The reality is that, many people don't need to go on a gluten-free diet to feel better. And if we aim for this perfect diet, then many people are going to fail. So, and maybe then also, giving them a couple of supplements, whether it's just a fish oil initially, or a B complex, or it's just a saffron or a curcumin supplementation, and that might be dependent upon what finances they have available to them, and also what they're willing to take. So we really need to look at individual, then target changes in multiple areas, and as I said, people don't have to walk out with hundreds of dollars of supplements at the end of the consultation. Yeah,
I do like that point, because I've always stuck to the idiom that these are supplements, not maintenance. The main should be diet. Expecting absolutely. A supplement to take the place of an unhealthy diet will not give you any good results. I think it was Professor Tim Noakes said you can't outrun an unhealthy diet. Is that what?
Yes.
Something like that. With regards to your research, though, we tend to sort of brush over. We tend to sort of want the glowing results and the nice things that happen to people who take supplements. What about adverse interactions, particularly with regards to antidepressants or other medications they might be on? Did you find any issues here?
With the curcumin studies that I've done, many people, I can't remember specifically, but about 50% of people were on antidepressants. So I didn't exclude people on antidepressants. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to use quite a representative sample of people attending, completing the study.
Yeah.
So there wasn't any adverse, it was quite well tolerated. The curcumin antidepressant combination was quite well tolerated, so there wasn't really any issues from there. The main issue was around your digestive problems that sometimes people experience.
Burping, bloating, cramping, which you can get from water.
Yes.
in a study. Or the placebo.
It's interesting that I've got, at the moment, even the teenage study, I think at the moment it's probably placebo getting more side effects than the... I don't know, but they're both... all I know is that the two groups, there's two different groups. I don't know which is which, but it seems as though the two are experiencing some digestive issues from both conditions. So.
Right. I know this is sort of skipping back to a previous point, but it just came up in my mind. When you're looking at recruiting, Adrian... when you're looking at recruiting your subjects for the trials and you're based in a university, how does that recruitment take place?
I've been using a lot of kind of social media to recruit. So I haven't been using university samples, which often is the case in many studies. Right. So, with the advent of social media, you can promote the study to a wide range of individuals, and that's where I've probably got the most of my participants. Okay,
so now back to the present. When you're speaking about, a significant portion of these participants being on medications, what about the responsibilities and perhaps even red flags when you're treating people, depressed patients who might be on medications? How do you refer back to their psychiatrist to say, hey, listen, they're part of this trial? Or indeed, how do you defer and say, I got a hands off here because there's something going on here that, I think it's serious, you need to handle something? What do you do there on an ethical perspective?
Well, I mean, in the studies, you're trying to use a less complicated group of individuals from a health perspective, and also even with regards to your medication. So many people who are on multiple medications, you're not going to include them in a study, and because it just complicates things from that perspective. Yep. And then also people presenting with your serious mental health disturbances or suicidal ideation or things like that. you won't include it in the study because you just can't you can't work well. You can't kind of monitor those individuals very well. So not so much of an issue with regards to the studies because they'll be excluded. I mean, but obviously within our practice, if we're working with individuals on medications, it's extremely important for us to be able to liaise with their general practitioner or psychiatrist if they're seeing one.
So for the future, I noted that you've also done some research into SAGE in its cognitive enhancive and maybe protective effects. What do you think, when you're looking at depressed people who can't think straight as part of this inflammatory process, have you got any thoughts about including SAGE in further trials? Or is that done and dusted? How did it work?
Well, I wrote a review paper on SAGE. I actually haven't done any personal studies on the effects of SAGE. So I looked particularly at just reviewing the evidence in terms of its efficacy on cognitive function. And the results were really quite positive. Unfortunately, it's kind of slowed down. So a lot of the research around SAGE has slowed down. And that's something that I certainly would like to look at some stage, but it all depends on time and funding, I suppose. But I think certainly SAGE as an adjunct to antidepressant medications, whether they be natural or pharmaceutical, might be a really interesting thing to look at because we know that cognitive deficits is a common symptom with people with depression. Yeah.
And I guess just as a wrap-up question, when you're talking about negative thoughts that are included in this feeling of depression, this feeling of non-worth, of guilt, of lack of self-esteem. And it's often sort of said that, negativity breeds negativity. So for those people who are already in that mindset, they don't see the light in the tunnel, how hard do you find it to twig them, to turn them towards a point in the tunnel where there is light? It may be distant, but there is a glimmer of light. How hard do you find that? What sort of tricks do you employ, I guess, to show people, hey, there's another direction?
I mean, it can be very difficult. I think that, certainly, the characteristic of depression is that demotivation. So getting many people with depression to change can be very difficult. And that's where really, it's about, again, I'm going to harp on it, about just working with the individual and just personalising the treatment, developing a good rapport with them, providing information about why we're doing what we're doing, and then asking them, what changes can they make? Here's a list of possibilities that we can work on. There's dietary changes, there's exercise, there's sleep, there's supplements, there's psychological techniques, and which ones are you ready to work on, and how much change are you willing to make in that particular area? So it's really assessing their motivation and then assessing their barriers to change. If they're lacking in energy, getting them to exercise is going to be very difficult. So maybe we'll work on energy first. If a big issue for them is around, I suppose the thing too is that for many, I suspect many naturopaths are listening to these podcasts is also assessing, is the naturopathic approach or the dietary changes, should you be working on that first? So there are other factors that maybe you need to work on first, or maybe you need to refer on. Maybe they do need some psychological therapy. Maybe they need some assistance around stress management. Maybe they need to increase their social networks. And that's the one that you may need to work on first. So whether you have the skills to do that yourself or refer on, I'm a big believer in working with several other disciplines. And I think it's a multidisciplinary approach where we respect each other's skills and strengths, and we work together as a team to help the individual.
I said the last question, but of course I've now got another question. When you're talking about interreferral, how do you dialogue with somebody, with a psychiatrist who, let's face it, they're going to be at the top of the pecking order with regards to intervention. I guess, there's an area of an air of responsibility and indeed litigation that they've got to cover. How do you dialogue and interrefer with psychiatrists in particular, indeed other professions? And how do you find the interreferral back? Do you find that happens, or do they tend to sort of say you hands off? Are they unwilling to acknowledge that there may be a dietary or place for supplements?
Well, there's going to be, there is a selection of psychiatrists who just really aren't willing to look at that or consider diets or supplements as an intervention. And for those people, their eyes are closed and they're just not willing to acknowledge the role that it has. But saying that, I think for the majority of psychiatrists, they are, aware of the importance of diet, and they are willing to acknowledge that. The issue, though, is how much, and I suppose this is the thing I want people to consider, is how much do they liaise with doctors and psychiatrists? I must admit, I have never, ever received a letter or a phone call, really, from a naturopath contacting me and saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. And so I've never received that phone call. So I'm not saying it's not happening, but I've never received that phone call. So I really challenge people to ask themselves, do they liaise? Do they pick up the phone? Do they send a letter just providing an update to the psychiatrist or doctor, just providing them with some information about the intervention that's been offered and the formulation and so forth? And I think with that information, and sometimes what I've done is if I've included Saffron as part of their regimen, I might include a copy of the paper.
Yeah.
So I send a letter, and I've included a copy of the paper of my paper, for example, on Saffron on a review. And whether they do anything with that, I don't know. But it's at least showing them that I'm not just doing things that are based on my opinion. I am. There is a research component to a lot of the work that I'm doing. So, and I think that makes them a lot more open. I now get psychiatrists emailing me saying, hey, what recommendations do you have? I've got somebody with PTSD. Are there any supplements that you might recommend in conjunction with the work that I'm doing? So it does happen. It takes time, but you do need to put some effort into liaising and developing a relationship with them.
Dr. Adrian Lopresti, I thank you so much for joining us on FX Medicine today, not just taking us through the exciting things with regards to, some interventions with regards to curcumin and saffron, but I think very importantly and responsibly the care that you take with your patients in personalising their approach. And lastly, I wish you well in your future endeavours, showing what results these interventions have in your patients. I really thank you for your previous and future work. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andrew, for having me.
This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. The Bioceuticals Integrative Medicine Awards are fast approaching. The Beamers showcase the outstanding talent we have in the Australasian integrative medicine profession and are held in conjunction with the Bioceuticals Research Symposium. To book your ticket to this gala dinner event, visit bioceuticals.com.au and click on the Education tab.